Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this Book at Lunchtime event on Empires of the Mind, written by Professor Robert Gildea. My name is Philip Bullock, and I have the great privilege of serving as director of Torch. I'm delighted to welcome Robert today to speak about his book, and also on the panel we have Faridah Zaman and Rana who will be chairing as well as discussing. The empires of the future would be the empires of the mind. So declared Churchill in 1943, envisaging universal empires living in peaceful harmony. Instead, as Robert exposes in this book, the brutal realities of decolonialisation and neo-colonialism have shaped our post-war world. Even after the rush of French and British decolonisation in the 1960s, the strings of economic and military power too often remained in the hands of the former colonial powers. The more empire appears to have declined and fallen, the more a fantasy of empire has been conjured up as a model for projecting power onto the world stage, legitimising colonialist intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. This aggression, along with the imposition of colonial hierarchies in metropolitan society, has excluded, alienated and even radicalised immigrant populations. And meanwhile, nostalgia for empire has bedevilled relations with Europe and played a large part in explaining Brexit. In a moment, I'll hand over to Rana, who will introduce the book and the rest of the panel. This will be followed by a reading by Robert. Afterwards, our commentators will present their thoughts on the book from their particular disciplinary backgrounds. Robert will be able to respond to some of the points raised in the discussion, and we will welcome your questions and observations from the audience. It's a great pleasure to be here to introduce this fifth book at lunchtime of this academic year and the first one of this term and this new year. Book at Lunchtime is Torch's flagship event series, taking the form of fortnightly bite-sized book discussions with a range of commentators and from a wide variety of academic disciplines. Please do take a look at our website and our newsletter for the full programme for this term. So all that remains for me to do is to thank you for coming and to introduce our chair. Rana is Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China in the Faculty of History at Oxford University and Director of the University China Centre. Rana's work focuses on the emergence of nationalism in modern China, both in the early 20th century and in the present era. He's particularly interested in the impact of China's war with Japan in the 1930s and 40s on the development of Chinese politics, society and culture. So welcome. It's a great privilege to hand over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed, Philip, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this slightly gloomy lunchtime, but I think we'll relieve the gloom very shortly with some vigorous conversation and discussion. So if I may, I'll start briefly by introducing our speaker today. I think he doesn't need much introduction because his fame is compelling enough to have brought a significant group of people here today at lunchtime. But Robert Gildea is Professor of Modern History in the Faculty of History here at Oxford. He is a specialist on modern France and has produced a whole range of wonderful books, including Marianne in Chains, which I think means that you're no longer welcome in the French town where you did much of the research and discovered there were all sorts of nasty things crawling in the underbelly of their Second World War experience. But it's a book that historians have admired greatly over the years, followed up very recently by Fighters in the Shadows, A New History of the French Resistance. Again, a wonderful, groundbreaking piece of work based on painstaking historical archival work and oral history as well. That's all set the scene for Robert's move, which is going to be very evident in the book he'll talk to us about in just a moment, which is from a national history in the sense that we have with France to a transnational and interdisciplinary type of project in which ideas of transnational approaches to resistance in Europe between the Spanish Civil War and Cold War are now operating in a framework well beyond just the area of France itself. And I think that that approach is going to be very evident in the book that we're going to discuss today, Empires of the Mind. Before we turn to that, I'll just introduce, if I may, our commentator today. Professor Faridah Zaman is Associate Professor of the History of Britain and the World here in the Faculty of History at Oxford and also a Fellow of Somerville College. And Faridah's two main areas of research are firstly on the study of Muslim political activists, religious scholars, journalists and poets in early 20th century British India, and the other on history itself as an academic discipline in Britain from the late 18th century and the way its relationship, the relationship of that historiography to the expansion and legitimation of empire. So a very expert person in terms of speaking to the subject of today. But the book that we're going to spend some time hearing about and debating and discussing is Robert's newest book, Empires of the Mind, which is originally a presentation done as part of the prestigious Wiles Lectures series at Queen's University, Belfast, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, which has been built into a really magnetic study of the way in which not the experience of empire itself so much, but the aftermath of empire has shaped two of the most important European empires, the British and the French. And in a sense, it's a book that is full of sort of ghosts, Robert, I think, but ghosts that are very much present in part of the politics that shapes us today. I'll say the word Brexit now because I suspect that there is no way we can avoid it coming up in the course of the next hour or so, but I won't say anything more about it at this moment. I have more comments, and Faridah, of course, has plenty as well, on this wonderful book. But before we do that, I'm going to ask if you would lead us off perhaps with an extract of some thoughts about this book, Empires of the Mind.
Yes, thank you, Rana. As you said, this book started off as a series of lectures that dealt only with French history, and then during the course of thinking about it and beginning to write it, I thought I had to bring in British history and British colonial history as well, because otherwise, is France an exception? Is it not an exception? And also that their histories, post-war histories and histories of decolonisation were very closely entangled, although they actually took very different decisions at key moments. So I'm going to read a piece which says a bit about, it's taken from chapter 3, which is called The Imperialism of Decolonisation, which is not a term I invented myself, but I think it encapsulates this notion that decolonisation was not a simple business. There was a great reluctance to decolonise and all sorts of tricks undertaken by both France and Britain to try to mitigate its progress. So I'm going to talk about that, and then there are various bits where I talk about things. Particularly, there's a passage about the unveiling of Muslim women in Algiers in 1958, which in a sense is a marker which feeds, which looks forward. This theme of unveiling of Muslim women is taken up with the unveiling conference in France in 1989 and 2004. But anyway, here we go. The French government carried on regardless with its war in Algeria until it committed one massacre too many. On the 8th of February 1958, it ordered an air attack on Sakiet Sidi Youssef in Tunisia, from which FLN rebels were undertaking attacks on French forces in Algeria. This raid killed 75 and wounded twice as many. The government was overthrown by the National Assembly. A final withdrawal from Algeria by the decrepit Fourth Republic looked possible, but the army would have none of it. General Salon wrote to the President of the Republic, René Coty, on the 19th of May to say, quote, "The French army would unanimously feel the abandonment of this national territory as an outrage. Its reaction of despair could not be accounted for." The reaction came on the 13th of May 1958 when a combination of the military and Pieds Noirs seized power in Algiers to prevent this imminent, quote, abandonment. Salon and Massu formed a committee of public safety to restore order and called upon de Gaulle to take the reins of power in what became the Fifth Republic. This is sometimes seen as an apotheosis, when the former Free French came together with the Army of Africa and the Algerian population in a momentary vision of what might have been a new Algeria. The so-called apotheosis, however, involved the ceremonial unveiling of Muslim women who had long been considered governed by Islamic law and outside the pale of French citizenship, but were now going to become voting citizens for the first time. Raymond Dronne, the first soldier of General Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division into liberated Paris in August 1944, said, quote, "It was a brilliant sign of reconciliation and an act of faith in France." Ceremonies, in inverted commas, were organised in Algiers and other cities on the 16th of May 1958, in which Muslim women removed their veils, but the use of force was thinly disguised. Frantz Fanon, who had worked in a psychiatric hospital outside Algiers and witnessed the effects of torture on Algerian suspects, saw the veil as a battleground between coloniser and colonised, linked to rape and colonial domination. He wrote, "This woman who sees without being seen frustrates the colonizer. She does not surrender, give herself, offer herself. Each veil torn away presents colonists with horizons until then obscured and exposes Algerian flesh piece by piece. The occupier sees in each Algerian woman newly unveiled an Algerian society whose defence systems are being dislocated, opened, kicked in. It seems for a moment that violence would save French Algeria for another day. In British Africa, on the other hand, violence ushered in the end of empire. On the 3rd of March 1959, there were 2 massacres, one in Kenya, the other in Nyasaland. In the Hola internment camp in Kenya, 8 Mau Mau prisoners were beaten to death by their warders. In this case, news did get out, and Colonial Secretary Alan Lennox Boyd had to explain himself before the House of Commons. He called the Mau Mau, quote, forest terrorists who indulged in, quote, sexual and sadistic aberrations, murder and cannibalism. Of the 63,000 Kenyans rounded up under the 1954 Operation Anvil, he said that only 13,000 were still interned because they were classed as Z, that is, not responding to rehabilitation. Against him was mobilised the Movement for Colonial Freedom and Labour MP Barbara Castle, who called for his resignation. Quote, we shall not lay the foundations for the multiracial society in which we on this side believe, because we believe in the equality of men and race of every race and colour, she argued, unless we react as completely to any outrage against Africans as we would to any outrage against white men. And there's just one more paragraph. The twin myths of a peaceful transfer of power by the British to former colonial authorities and of the French Empire defending itself by violence seem clear from these narratives. All was not so simple. Ian Cobain has chronicled how in May 1961, Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod ordered that all documents that might embarrass the military police, intelligence services and Her Majesty's government in general, or be used, quote, unethically by post-independence governments, should be kept secret. This order was developed in 1962 as Operation Legacy, and in December 1963, just before independence, Kenyan files were flown back to Gatwick while others were said to have been dumped into the sea. These, quote, migrated archives were kept in Hayes and then in a purpose-built facility in Hanslope Park. But it was not until 2011, when Mau Mau victims were pursuing compensation claims in British courts, that the government existed to the existence of 1,500 Kenya files. And Rana and I know a bit more about these files now, but that's for another bit of a discussion, possibly. Right.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for giving us that startling insight into, I think, the wider theme that the book presents. And I think the centrality of violence to the colonial experience and the post-colonial experience is one of the things that I felt most strongly in reading the book. And I think it's a theme that we will come back to as we continue our discussions. Before continuing that, I'd like to turn straight away, if I may, to Faridah and ask if, having read Empires of the Mind, you might want to share with us for a little while your thoughts and ideas on the book.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. As Rana said in the introduction, I mainly work on the British Empire, so those bits of the book were more familiar to me than the French aspects, and actually the comparison, the contrast, the way in which the histories are sort of entangled but sometimes diverge was really sort of an interesting and kind of illuminating aspect of the book. So thank you for that. My comments come in the form of questions, which are sort of somewhat scattered, but I hope that sort of opens up conversation a little bit, and I hope that's okay with you. So one thing that struck me quite a bit in this book was the role of settlers, sort of both in the British and in the French case. So in the British case with the Dominions, with kind of Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and so forth, and in the French case with the Pied Noirs, who play a particularly kind of significant role, of course, in Algeria and kind of Algeria's 20th century history. And then, curiously, they end up playing quite a significant, if more kind of symbolic rather than kind of numerically significant role in France post-empire. And I wonder, I suppose, firstly, whether you see a difference between the settler colonial parts of both British and French Empire and the non-settler colonial parts. And I ask partly because many years ago, many decades ago, historians like Pocock, suggested that imperial history was really the history of places where the English went. The British Empire, the British history was the places where the British went. And the other parts of the empire were kind of a different, they were sort of just categorically quite different, and that their histories, that the ways that we might understand those histories are quite different. And so I wonder whether, when it comes to the 19th and the 20th century, particularly in the 20th century, whether you see the legacies as differing. And I suppose in the British case then, is there a story of kind of British pieds noirs? Are there people who return from India, from Ceylon, from Hong Kong, from Kenya even, I suppose. And in the Kenyan case, often these are sort of people who are sort of twice migrants within the empire. And to what extent do those returning settlers have any part to play in the British story of decolonisation? I also wonder about resistance. I think the passage that you read out is one of the instances where Barbara Castle pops up and the movement for colonial freedom. And so there is a sort of, there is, at least in the British case, some long-standing critique of empire, of empire and then the process of decolonisation. To what extent does that play a sort of important role in your kind of conceptualization of the story? Do you think it's a sort of a niggling sort of critique, or is there actually something quite sort of substantive to be said about these stories? And partly this is sort of this question is from my own kind of thinking recently about how when we think about British and French domestic politics, where we spend a lot of sort of effort kind of teasing out the ideological differences, political differences between parties and policies and whatnot. But when we come to imperial history, we often resort to kind of big categories like the British and the French, right? And so I wonder if there's a space to reconcile those two things, whether we can think about resistance and sort of ideological difference. And that, I suppose, leads to a very related question, which is, there are moments in the book where it's noted whether a prime minister or government in Britain is conservative or Labour, and in the French case, whether it's socialist or right-wing. Sometimes it seems like it matters whether the party is centre-left or socialist, and sometimes it seems like it doesn't really matter. That particularly when it comes to immigration policy, sometimes even if the rhetoric is slightly different, the impact is much the same. And so I suppose I wonder about the role of ideology and whether there is actually any political difference in the kind of political spectrums of British and French kind of thinking about empire. Repetition is quite important, I think. Rana talked about ghosts. There are lots of kind of really interesting echoes and repetitions, both across the British and French cases, and within each sort of national or imperial case. So one that I didn't know very much about was the case of sort of France in New Caledonia, which, as you say, in the 1980s, the kind of France's attempt to kind of its handling of New Caledonia has lots of echoes of its, very protracted struggle in Algeria, but also some sort of resonances with the Falklands. And I think you say quite rightly that the significance of New Caledonia is quite different to the significance of the Falklands because it doesn't provoke the kind of outpouring of nationalist and kind of jingoistic sentiment that it did in Britain. But I imagine that people at the time would have been making that connection, wouldn't they? That they would have seen this as sort of these two instances of these old European powers going out on a limb on distant shores. And so I suppose the broader question there is about how useful is the language or the imagery of repetition, of echoes, of ghosts? To what extent is this about sort of being kind of trapped in certain cycles of repetition and violence? I think it's sort of suggested towards the beginning and the introduction that there is a sort of when you kind of talk about Freud and repetition, that there's the inability of Britain and France to exorcise certain kinds of violent pasts mean that they're sort of doomed to repeat them. Is that the claim? Are we sort of trapped in a kind of cycle, or is there a sort of way out, or is it less sort of determined than that, I suppose? Related to that, in turn, I suppose, the subtitle of the book is The Colonial Past and the Politics of the Present. And of course, much history, I would argue, all history is in some ways a kind of a history of the present. But I think you're quite right that with histories of empire and immigration, perhaps that's true more than in other cases. But were there, when you were kind of researching this book, and were there moments that you thought sort of didn't fit the narrative, that didn't produce the present that we know now? Were there moments that sort of surprised you, or that you thought sort of didn't fit in to the story as we know it now? Were there sort of ideas or ventures that you think might have produced genuinely different futures, or a genuinely different sort of present for us now? You mentioned in the conclusion that there were moments of possibility in the late 20th century, so particularly after the 1973 oil crisis and at the end of the Cold War. And Robert suggests these are sort of two moments in which there's a possibility for rethinking the world order. So in the 1970s, after the oil crisis, there's a glimmer of hope that the Third World might be able to actually sort of take on the very kind of US and sort of Anglo-centric world order. And then at the end of the Cold War, with the end of this a very sort of protracted struggle, that there might be a sort of a new understanding of world order. But are there moments sort of in the earlier period, maybe in the 19th or 20th century, that you think actually this is a moment in which a kind of a decision or a course was struck that actually was quite decisive, and it might have gone another way? I suppose, because I've now already asked a lot of questions, I might end with one about memory and education. I was thinking a little bit about, because memory, I think myth-making memory, the failure to kind of reconcile, is quite sort of pervasive throughout the book. And I was thinking of a case, it's always a sort of case study of memory studies gone right, which is often kind of Germany, right? That after the Second World War, there is a quite sort of impressive and concerted effort to reckon with the memory of the Holocaust and whatnot. And people often sort of tout it as a very kind of not entirely uncomplicated, but certainly a quite successful attempt to kind of memorialize, to remember the sort of, to kind of make sure that repetition isn't in kind of Germany's future. And all that we might say about kind of German domestic politics at the moment, I think, I wonder whether in the British and French case, the problem of empire is actually a rather proximate problem, which is that the generations that grew to maturity in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, who should have actually taken the responsibility to reconcile with, to write kind of definitive accounts of the violence of empire and decolonisation. Actually, that didn't happen. So in the book, there are critics, there are people like Barbara Castle, but often the critic is a sort of outsider, or someone who's got one foot in and one foot out, someone like Stuart Hall. But where are the British and the French kind of intellectuals? Where is that sort of public reckoning? Where is that sort of debate? Why is it that we're still debating whether the school curriculum in Britain should be about our island story, or whether it should be something else? Like, isn't that a more proximate failure than that kind of long history, that 2-3 century long history of violence might suggest? Are we not, sitting in institutions like Oxford, are we not actually, isn't the sort of responsibility somewhat sort of closer to home than we might think? Yes, and I think I'll probably leave it there for now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Just a few thoughts, really, but extremely stimulating.
There were more, I abbreviated.
We have plenty more time as well, I'm glad to say, so those thoughts may yet have a chance to emerge. If I may, I might follow up directly on that by giving a few thoughts of my own, Robert, on your wonderful book and some of the implications for it in a couple of slightly different areas from the ones that Faridah has put forward, and then we'll unleash all of these on you to come back to us.
It's like
and
being in a
you're-
defilled vibe, isn't it?
Well, I was about to say, in this case, the empire gets to strike back, but not for a couple of minutes. I want to start my comments in the same place that you started your presentation, and that's Algeria, and particularly with a film that you know very well and that many here will know, which is Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers. And I remember seeing this in, not the first time, but the most recent time, in September of last year, in an audience. It was being specially shown. And a great deal of reaction, discussion, very, very interesting feedback from the audience on that particular film. I'm sure people know, but just in case, it's a great account which is fiction, but based very much on drawing on real life experience and indeed drawing in. I think there's only one professional actor in the whole thing. Is that right? The guy who plays the French hard-nosed kind of. All the rest, I think, were sort of amateur or semi-amateur actors, reenacting basically the last part of one of the great confrontations in the last part of the Algerian War of Independence in the late 1950s, and it's a magnificent work of art as well as a very important historical statement. So the reaction to this film was very interesting, but to me it was very interesting for a particular reason, which is that this showing was taking place in Beijing, and the audience was about 1/3 Chinese, 1/3 American, and 1/3 from other countries around the world. And I found myself thinking, and I think the nature of the discussion in a sense reflected some of this, that with that audience, you got an idea of, I think, part of what your idea of empires of the mind gets to, because the idea of empire is very slippery, flexible if you want to be more complimentary about it, perhaps, and has a whole variety of valencies that could be very, very different depending on who's doing the listening and the discussing. By which I mean for, let's say, Chinese viewers of that particular film. It's a film about anti-colonial struggle, about national liberation. That is a story that the Chinese know extremely well. We talked about school curricula just now from what Faridah has mentioned. Every Chinese school child is told about the Opium Wars, in which the UK, I have to say, played a pretty central and not particularly respectable part. The French came along pretty quickly afterwards to join in, one has to say. And then all the way through the late 19th, early 20th century, there is clearly a very strong discourse of national humiliation in the terms the Chinese themselves quite often use about this experience of foreign powers over and over again invading and occupying. And to that extent, there is clearly a responsive chord in a Chinese audience for that particular film. But there's also another issue, and this is a more problematic one if you're a Chinese audience, which is that China too is an empire, and China is a country which also has its own struggles happening right now, this week, when it comes to race, ethnicity, class, actually a term that we don't hear as much as we might do, but actually I think is a very important and underappreciated factor in terms of some of the fractures that are going on in the China of today. And to that extent, there's a question of when you have, the French colonel who is basically cracking down hard on the FLN, is that a figure, is it the FLN fighter who a Chinese viewer will be identifying with in the present day? Is it the French colonel? Is it a bit of both? And that ability, and I think that film was not shown accidentally by any means at this particular venue in Beijing, shows, I think, the way in which, again, to steal another phrase that cultural theorists love, but I'll use it if I may, why empire is good to think with in this particular case, why using this particular artistic rendition of a particular set of historical facts can have valency importance, both geographically and chronologically, a very long way away from where they originated. And I wanted to use that as a starting point to make basically the first of just 2 points that I wanted to make in response to the book and to get your reaction. The first one actually is about the question of cultural integration, understanding, processing and debate of the experience of empire. Amongst many of the elements that you discuss in the book, you do bring up, for instance, the Satanic Verses controversy of the late 80s, early 90s, and Salman Rushdie's role as, obviously the centre of that particular controversy, but also the book itself and what it meant in the context of the post-colonial British environment in particular. It reminded me of a conversation that I had recently with the writer and critic Sushila Nasta, who was the first editor of Wasafiri, which has just celebrated its 100th edition, at that time the first and still one of the most important journals which showcases what has become known as post-colonial literature, and which, when it started up in, I think, 1983, was a very lone outpost of being able to showcase the kind of writing which I think we sometimes complacently have almost made a sort of commonplace of what certainly the British cultural environment is today. The fact that we have the Salman Rushdies and Ben Oakreys and Zadie Smiths and whoever else it might be, it is worth remembering that in a period within not only historical memory, but certainly the ambit of Robert's book and living memory for some of us, me rather than Faridah, I think, this was a very different environment in terms of understanding what the culture of empire was. It's no coincidence that actually that was the same time that the highest rated television series on British television that year, I think, 1981, I think, was Jewel and the Crown. Actually, if you go back to it, in many ways, rather ahead of its time, sensitive, high quality, and actually very, ambivalent about empire, as the Paul Scott novels that it was based on are as well. But also, and this is the ambivalence, I think, for an awful lot of viewers, if not necessarily the makers of it, an exercise in romantic nostalgia about empire as well. And I have to say, and one doesn't always go forward in these things. Did anyone here see a show that went out last year called Beecham House? Did you like it? I don't think it's going to commission for a second. I don't have inside knowledge at ITV, but I don't think it's coming out for a second series. It was Downton it was sort of Downton Abbey. It had a certain amount of adaptation to the norms of understanding that empire couldn't be simply celebrated. And in some senses, it was sensitive to that. But apart from the fact it really wasn't very good drama, it still was a series set in late 18th century India that shared many of the sort of romantic assumptions about empire, without necessarily even meaning to, that I think in some ways were not a great advance from where people had been in the 1980s. So I suppose the question that comes from all of that is, over that stretch of time, how much of it all do you think actually there has been a change, for the better or worse, or however it might be, in the British cultural environment relating to empire, as opposed to more of the kind of political side of things in the more direct sense? And how comparable or not is the French side of that? And the second point I'd like to make is a comparator, and I offer it, for comparison. It may or may not be useful to have, but I'd like to bring it up, which is that as a specialist on East Asia, the empire that I end up thinking about most myself is the empire of Japan in the mid-20th century. And the Japanese empire has both huge similarities to the British and French in the 20th century, not least because it was largely modelled on the kind of things that went on there. The South Manchuria Railway Company, which was the hybrid commercial political body that ran large parts of northeast China in the early 20th century, was very explicitly based on the East India Company, and there are other examples, of course, that come off the back of that. But Japan was different in terms of decolonisation, in that because of its defeat in the Second World War, it ended up being decolonised very fast, not least under its own occupation by the United States between 1945 and 1952. And unlike the First World War, where 2 or 3 empires, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, were dismantled very fast, Japan is the only major empire, at least that I can think of, that had that very, very swift period of moving from being one of the world's major empires to not being an imperial power at all in that short gap. And I think that that has affected the question I just asked you about Britain and France in what I know about Japan, in that empire floats very, very close under the surface, even today, of both politics and culture in Japan. If you see the current, as in today, this week, dispute between Japan and South Korea, which is ostensibly about trade, but it's not really about trade. It's about basically the use of enforced sexual slavery of Korean women during the Second World War, an issue which has never really been satisfactorily resolved. And more broadly speaking, the unabsorbed meaning of what the Japanese Empire actually did and meant in the mid-20th century. And I only have to say that for everyone, I'm sure, to see that there are tremendous numbers of comparisons with the European case studies that you put forward. Just 2 quick cultural examples that came to mind from work that I did partly in interviews last year in Japan. 2 filmmakers, I like being able to go to the cinema and claiming that it's research. It's always helpful. One from a filmmaker, Katabuchi Sunao, who made one of the great sleeper hits of a couple of years ago, a Japanese manga movie called In This Corner of the World. I don't know if anyone's seen this at all. Do check it out. It's a wonderful film, well worth seeing. About a little girl who turns into a young woman who's living through the Second World War in Japan and Hiroshima. You have seen it? Right, okay, well worth seeing. For a historian, particularly historians obsessed with empire, there are little hints here and there about things that are not quite as they... Because most of the story concentrates on her and her suffering and Hiroshima, which of course is, the huge, horrific trauma at the end of it. But it's about the fact that, when they're slowly starving to death, not enough food is coming in from Manchuria or from Taiwan or other parts of the empire. And again, echoes of things like the Bengal famine, which again is one of those imperial experiences which is still very little integrated into our wider understanding of modern British history, which is what it's part of. These sort of sit there under the surface in this film. And when I asked Katabuchi Sunao about it in talking to him, he had said that that element was there, and it was clearly intended to make clear that he wasn't approving of the empire, and it was very much part of that attempt to engage with it. But all the same, my feeling was, and I did say to him, that it seemed to be more on the side than it was at the centre. A contrast with another filmmaker, Arai Haruhiko, who has made several attempts to try and sort of deal with empire bang on, and found, as he put it quite plainly to us, that there is very little market. And bearing in mind that when you've got a film, you've got to make people go to a cinema and pay cash in the box office to actually go and see it, for a firm engagement with that experience. And I have to say, I think that is still probably truer of the British engagement with empire in culture. I mean, even in a film like Gandhi, which does portray the Amritsar massacre and so forth, is exceptional, and it's part of a wider narrative. Maybe French films, including things like Cachet and so forth, like the Algerian War, are kind of giving it more of a head-on engagement, but it still seems to be partial. So Japan, I think, I just wanted to bring up as another major empire, decolonising in some ways similarly, in other ways very differently from the European empires, but also suffering from the same sort of post-imperial syndrome. It's there, hidden under the surface. There's a sort of shamefacedness in some areas, there's pride in others, there's an ignorance in, I think, even more. And all of those go into meaning that the empires of the mind that you describe in the book, whether it's in Japan or in Britain or France, are still very current in all sorts of ways. So there is a set of thoughts, probably more directed from Faridah than from me to you, Robert, and I hope we could take some time now for you to sort of respond and reflect. Feel free, and then at the end we'll give you your marks.
Well, a lot of questions, and I'll try and answer most of them. I'll start with the last point that you made about the Chinese and the Japanese empires, because I gave a talk last summer to the Chalk Valley History Festival, which is just outside Salisbury. There was one non-white member of the audience, and basically a lot of ex-military type people. I was given a very hard time for doing down the British Empire, and one of the questions was, why haven't you written about the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire? And I said, well, actually,
that's next week.
Outside my expertise, but I think Rana, you've talked yourself into writing a book about the Chinese Empire and the Japanese Empire from those perspectives. There is the danger, that I've confronted, of being accused of being unpatriotic or down on Britain. The book is coming out in France next month, and I think they'll probably be quite interested in how down I am on Britain, because the account is more favourable to the French than to the British. So to answer some of Faridah's questions, settlers and settler colonialism, it's a pity that Karma can't be here today, because she introduced me to the notion of settler colonialism through, she asked me to chair a meeting by a dissident Israeli historian who writes about settler colonialism in his own country, and his books cannot be translated into Hebrew. So, and I started looking it up and became quite interested in this idea that there's a lovely picture in this book where you can see a picture of a sort of settler wagon rolling across a completely empty plain, page 23. But what this taught me was that, a settlement involves expropriation and very often extermination. I mean, the story of the Tasmanians is just one example. Where are the Pieds Noirs, the settlers now? I mean, actually, a lot of the Algerian settlers did finish up in New Caledonia. Good question about British settlers. I mean, Lucian and I met one of them in the Labour Party in the 1990s. She'd come back to Oxford from Kenya, I think, and was a ferocious Labour person, but I'm not sure she was typical. In the book, I do suggest that Northern Ireland is a settler colony, and I've had surprisingly little flack for that, but maybe because people haven't read the book. But I do think it can be seen as a settler colony in some ways. In terms of long-standing critiques of the empire, I mean, I referenced, as you said, Barbara Castle and the movement of colonial freedom. I became quite interested in that. There's a wonderful guy called Fenner Brockway, who I think was born in Calcutta, and he was imprisoned in the First World War as a conscientious objector, and he is the sort of driving force of the movement for colonial freedom. Writes about goes out and looks at the British system in Kenya. One of the other people in that movement was Tony Benn. So I think it is quite a powerful critique of empire. Does it matter if people were right or left? I mean, my feeling is that actually it doesn't. I wanted to sort of let the Labour Party off, particularly in the 1960s, but you can't really let them off immigration policy and so on. And also, if you take the French case, the French Socialist Party, the SFIO, broke in two over Algeria, and you had a breakaway party, the PSU. So it's difficult. There was a wonderful short-lived French minister, sort of minister for the colonial sphere. I can't remember the exact title, called Jean-Pierre Caux, and he. When we talked earlier about ethical foreign policies, he tried to bring in an ethical foreign and colonial policy into the Mitterrand government. He lasted about 5 minutes before he's chucked out. Interestingly, he was the son of another left-wing anti-colonialist from the sort of 30s and 40s, Pierre Caux. Repetition. Trauma, repetition, working through. I mean, there is a Freudian dimension to this, and one of the points I make is that there are these. One of the things about colonialism is this kind of this sort of inability to move on from colonial aggression and ways of asserting power over areas in which theoretically you've forfeited at least formal control. But it is true that there are. I do talk about, perhaps not enough, about moments when this could have all changed. I mean, for example, 1919. I mean, a lot of people from from Vietnam or Egypt came to Versailles to lobby leaders about decolonisation and nothing going. Again, a big moment in 1945. Defeated Japan that you mentioned, United Nations. Big possibilities for decolonisation, which didn't immediately happen. I mean, the British let go of India, but this made it much more important for them to hold on to the Middle East and East Africa and places like that. I think there were moments, as you say, in the 1970s with the oil crisis and this idea of a new economic order in some third world countries, including Algeria, where they sort of took back control of their economies. And I show that this it's a bit of the book which I'm not totally confident in because I'm not an economic historian, but it seems to me that the Washington consensus of trying to control these countries through the IMF and the World Bank and using their debt to assert control, I think that is a kind of reality. There was again the so-called holiday from history in the 1990s when things were supposed to get easier, and then of course we finished up with 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, which I show is just a renewed form of colonialism. There's also another moment of change, which I point to at the end of the book, is the years 2015, 2017, because it's at that point when the British, the Tory party wins the elections and Cameron has to concede a referendum on Europe, whereas in 2017 Macron sees off Marine Le Pen, and they have a very different outcome. On the Battle of Algiers, yes, I think there's a whole question about whether viewers identify with perpetrators or with victims. I mean, interestingly enough, there was a huge debate in France around 2000 when the whole debate about torture in the Algerian War cropped up again. But again, I think one of the a lot comes down to the way what we call people. If we call people terrorists, it's very difficult to see them as freedom fighters, and of course. So I think the kind of politics of the way that the politics on the nomenclature is quite important. On the question of cultural integration, I mean one of the points in the book, which I suppose we've talked about a bit less, is the fact that I try to show that empire exists at home in the metropolis as well as out there in the way we behave towards other parts of the world, and in particular. I tried to show that there have been attempts to integrate, to develop multicultural societies, but there is also a kind of there are these reflexes which talk about immigrants as invaders, which feel that the ways of immigration can coincided with the end of empire, and therefore they are felt as a kind of defeat, and one of the responses to that are often an insistence on the home country as being ethnically homogenous. That's the case with the right in this country, but also the sort of Le Pen types in France. There's an insistence on telling a kind of national story, which is always a national story of the dominant race. And there's also an insistence on national sovereignty. So all these tropes come back from Enoch Powell to the present day. I think those were the main points that I wanted to reply to.